Victoria Sterling stands frozen in her penthouse as flames devour everything around her. In the distance, sirens wail through the night. 49 floors below, Captain Jake Morrison races up smoke-filled stairs, knowing he has minutes before the building's structure fails. One woman's life hangs in the balance, but neither realizes this rescue will ignite something neither saw coming. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The smoke alarm's piercing shriek cut through the silence of Victoria Sterling's penthouse at 2:47 a.m. She bolted upright in her king-sized bed, blonde hair cascading over her shoulders as her heart hammered against her ribs. The acrid smell of smoke filled her nostrils immediately, and orange light flickered ominously beneath her bedroom door. This wasn't a false alarm. This was real. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics and one of Forbes's most powerful women under 40, had conquered hostile takeovers and billion-dollar acquisitions, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of raw terror as flames began consuming the only home she'd known for the past 5 years. Captain Jake Morrison was halfway through his third cup of coffee when the alarm bells jolted Station 19 into action. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speakers with urgent precision. High-rise residential fire, Meridian Towers, penthouse level, possible entrapment. Jake's blood ran cold. Meridian Towers was one of the city's most exclusive buildings, where a single penthouse could cost more than his entire neighborhood. But wealth meant nothing when fire decided to take hold. He'd seen enough blazes consume million-dollar homes in minutes to know that money couldn't buy safety when the elements turned deadly. "Morrison, your lead on this one," Chief Reynolds barked as the team suited up with practiced efficiency. "High-value target, possible civilian trapped. Make it count." Jake nodded grimly, checking his oxygen tank and ensuring his radio was functioning properly. At 34, he'd been fighting fires for over a decade. But the weight of responsibility never got easier. Somewhere in that burning building was a human being whose life depended on his team's speed and skill. As they raced through the pre-dawn streets, sirens wailing and emergency lights painting the empty roads in strobing red and blue, Jake's mind automatically calculated response times, water pressure requirements, and evacuation protocols. The scene that greeted them at Meridian Towers was both spectacular and terrifying. Flames erupted from the top 3 floors like a crown of destruction against the dark sky, while thick black smoke billowed into the night air. The building's glass facade reflected the orange inferno, creating the illusion that the entire structure was consumed by fire. Dozens of residents had already evacuated and stood huddled on the sidewalk across the street, wrapped in hastily grabbed coats and blankets, their faces pale with shock as they watched their exclusive sanctuary transform into a nightmare. But Jake's attention was focused entirely on the penthouse level, where the flames burned brightest and most aggressively. "Status report," Jake commanded as his team deployed their equipment with military precision. The building's fire chief approached with sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. "Penthouse owner is Victoria Sterling, 36 years old. No response to emergency calls. The elevators are dead. Stairwells are compromised on floors 48 and 49. The fire started in the building's electrical system, but it's moved fast through the upper levels." Jake processed this information quickly, his mind racing through possible scenarios and escape routes. Victoria Sterling. He'd heard the name in business news reports, seen her face on magazine covers. A brilliant, ruthless CEO who'd built her father's modest construction company into a multinational empire. But none of that mattered now. She was simply a person who needed rescue. Victoria pressed herself against the floor of her walk-in closet, the marble tiles cool against her cheek as she tried to stay beneath the thickening smoke. Her silk nightgown offered no protection against the heat that seemed to seep through the walls themselves, and her bare feet were already tender from the increasingly hot flooring. The penthouse that had been her sanctuary, her symbol of success and independence, had become a death trap. Every breath burned her lungs as the smoke grew denser, and the temperature continued rising with relentless intensity. She'd tried calling 911 3 times, but her phone had lost signal as the fire damaged the building's cellular equipment. The landline was dead too, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. Through the closet's frosted glass door, she could see the orange glow growing brighter as flames consumed her living room. The custom furniture she'd chosen so carefully, the artwork she'd collected over years of success, the view of the city that had made her feel like a queen surveying her domain, all of it was being devoured by an enemy she couldn't negotiate with or outmaneuver. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling felt utterly powerless. Her mind, usually sharp and calculating, struggled to form coherent thoughts as fear and smoke inhalation took their toll. She thought about her assistant finding her empty office tomorrow, about board meetings that would happen without her, about the legacy she'd worked so hard to build potentially ending in ash and headlines. Jake and his partner Rodriguez took the stairs 3 at a time, their heavy gear clanging with each step as they climbed toward the inferno above. The stairwell was thick with smoke that reduced visibility to mere inches, forcing them to rely on their thermal imaging cameras and years of experience navigating in zero visibility conditions. By the 35th floor, the heat was becoming unbearable even through their protective suits, and Jake's radio crackled with updates from the team coordinating the water attack from below. "Fire's spreading faster than anticipated," came the chief's voice through the static. "You've got maybe 10 minutes before structural integrity becomes compromised. 10 minutes to find and extract a civilian from a penthouse that covered nearly 4,000 square feet. Jake had worked miracles in less time, but never in conditions this extreme. As they reached the 40th floor, the smoke was so dense that their thermal cameras could barely penetrate it, and the heat was intense enough to make the metal railings too hot to touch even through their insulated gloves. Rodriguez stumbled slightly, and Jake caught his arm, both men breathing hard through their oxygen masks. "You good?" Jake asked through the radio. "Good to go, Captain," Rodriguez responded, though Jake could hear the strain in his voice. They pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that every second counted. The 47th floor brought them close enough to hear the actual roar of the flames above, a sound like a massive predator consuming everything in its path. Jake had heard that sound hundreds of times, but it never failed to remind him why he'd chosen this profession despite the dangers, despite the long hours that had cost him his marriage 3 years ago, despite the nightmares that sometimes woke him in cold sweats. Somewhere above them was a person who needed them, and nothing else mattered. Victoria's world had narrowed to the space of the closet floor, and the struggle to find clean air in an environment increasingly dominated by toxic smoke. Her designer clothes hung above her like silent witnesses to her potential final moments, while heat radiated through the walls with growing intensity. She'd stopped crying after the first few minutes, conserving her energy and trying to think clearly despite the circumstances. The business skills that had made her successful, strategic thinking, problem-solving under pressure, refusal to accept defeat, struggled to find purchase in a situation where money and influence meant nothing. She thought about her father, who had died when she was 25, leaving her a modest construction company that most people expected her to sell rather than run. She'd proven them wrong by transforming Sterling Construction into Sterling Dynamics, a company that built everything from luxury hotels to cutting-edge office complexes. But her success had come at a personal cost. At 36, she had no spouse, no children, no close friendships that weren't tied to business interests. Her penthouse, beautiful and expensive as it was, had been more like a luxurious prison where she spent most evenings alone with her work and her ambitions. As the heat intensified and breathing became more difficult, Victoria found herself wondering if this was how her story would end. Not in a boardroom triumph or a strategic victory, but alone on the floor of a closet, surrounded by material possessions that had seemed so important just hours ago. The irony wasn't lost on her that the penthouse she'd bought to symbolize her success might become the place where her life ended. She closed her eyes and tried to regulate her breathing, using meditation techniques she'd learned in expensive executive wellness retreats, though nothing had prepared her for applying them while potentially facing death. Jake's thermal camera finally picked up a heat signature on the 49th floor as they approached the penthouse level. The signature was low to the ground and stationary, suggesting someone who had taken shelter close to the floor where the air was cleaner. "Got a possible civilian," he radioed to his team, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Northeast corner of the penthouse level." Rodriguez nodded and began preparing the extraction equipment while Jake calculated the fastest route through what remained of the penthouse layout. The penthouse door had been compromised by the heat, hanging partially off its hinges and offering little resistance as Jake shouldered through it. The interior was a hellscape of smoke and flame, with expensive furniture serving as fuel for the inferno that had consumed most of the main living area. Crystal chandeliers had crashed to the floor, and artwork had either burned or been damaged beyond recognition by smoke and heat. Jake moved through the destruction with purpose, following his thermal readings toward the northeast corner where the heat signature remained stable. The walk-in closet door was closed but not locked, and Jake could see through his thermal camera that the signature was definitely human, positioned low on the floor in a survival posture that suggested the person was still conscious and thinking clearly. He tried the door handle, found it unlocked, and carefully opened it to reveal a blonde woman in a silk nightgown pressed against the marble floor, her hair covering her face as she tried to breathe the slightly cleaner air near the ground. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Morrison with the fire department," Jake said, his voice muffled but clear through his mask as he knelt beside her. "I'm here to get you out." Victoria looked up at him with eyes that were red from smoke but still alert, and Jake felt a moment of relief that she was conscious and responsive. Her face was streaked with soot, but she was clearly aware of her surroundings and able to communicate. "Can you hear me?" he asked, placing a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. "Yes," Victoria managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation but audible. "I can't. The smoke." She struggled to form complete sentences, but Jake understood immediately. He'd seen this level of smoke inhalation before, and while she was still conscious, they needed to move quickly before her condition deteriorated further. "I'm going to carry you out," Jake explained, his tone calm and reassuring despite the urgency of their situation. "I need you to put your arms around my neck and hold on as tight as you can. Can you do that for me?" Victoria nodded weakly, and Jake carefully scooped her into his arms, noting that she was lighter than he'd expected and that her body was trembling slightly from shock and adrenaline. As he lifted her, she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, and he could feel the rapid beating of her heart against his chest. Through his protective gear, he caught a faint scent of expensive perfume mixed with smoke, a reminder that this was a real person with a real life, not just another rescue statistic. "Hold tight," Jake instructed as he began moving through the burning penthouse, navigating carefully around fallen debris and areas where the floor might be compromised by fire damage. Victoria's grip around his neck was surprisingly strong for someone who had been breathing smoke for over 20 minutes, and Jake took that as a positive sign that she retained enough strength and awareness to assist in her own rescue. Rodriguez appeared through the smoke, taking point to clear their path and ensure they didn't encounter any structural surprises on their way to the stairwell. The journey back through the burning penthouse felt both endless and instantaneous, with Jake's training taking over as he calculated each step to ensure Victoria's safety while moving as quickly as possible. She coughed occasionally against his shoulder, her body shaking with each spasm, but she maintained her grip and didn't panic despite the terrifying environment surrounding them. As they reached the compromised penthouse entrance, Jake could feel the building's structure beginning to shift slightly, a subtle but ominous sign that they were running out of time before potential collapse. The descent down 49 flights of smoke-filled stairs was a test of endurance for both rescuer and victim. Jake's legs burned with the effort of carrying Victoria's additional weight while wearing 60 pounds of protective gear, But adrenaline and years of physical conditioning pushed him forward. Victoria had stopped speaking after the first few floors, focusing all her energy on maintaining her hold around his neck, but Jake could feel that she remained conscious and alert throughout their descent. Rodriguez stayed close behind them, monitoring for any signs that Victoria's condition was deteriorating or that Jake needed assistance. By the 20th floor, Jake's radio crackled with increasingly urgent updates from the chief. "Morrison, structures showing signs of stress. We need you out of there in 5 minutes or less." Jake didn't waste breath responding, instead increasing his pace while being careful not to jostle Victoria unnecessarily. Her breathing had become more labored, and he could feel her grip weakening slightly, but they were close enough to safety now that he felt confident they would make it out together. The transition from the smoke-filled stairwell to the relatively clean air of the building's lobby was dramatic and immediate. Jake's lungs, protected by his oxygen supply, didn't feel the difference as acutely as Victoria's did, but he could sense her body relaxing slightly as they emerged into an environment where breathing no longer required conscious effort. Paramedics were waiting immediately outside the building, and Jake carefully transferred Victoria to their gurney, ensuring she was stable, before stepping back to let them begin their assessment. "You did great," Jake told Victoria, as the paramedics placed an oxygen mask over her face and began checking her vital signs. Her eyes, still red from smoke but clearer now, found his, and held his gaze for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the chaos surrounding them. She tried to speak around the oxygen mask, but Jake shook his head gently. "Don't try to talk right now. Just focus on breathing. You're safe." Something in her expression suggested she wanted to say more, but the paramedics were already wheeling her toward the waiting ambulance. As Jake watched the ambulance disappear into the early morning darkness, its red lights fading into the distance, he felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that came after a successful rescue. The building behind him continued to burn, though his team was making good progress in containing the fire and preventing it from spreading to adjacent structures. In a few hours, there would be investigations and reports and insurance claims, but right now, there was just the knowledge that one person was alive who might not have been without their intervention. Rodriguez clapped Jake on the shoulder as they began the process of packing up their equipment. "Hell of a carry, Captain. 49 floors with a civilian is no joke." Jake nodded, already thinking ahead to the paperwork that would need to be completed, and the debriefing session that would analyze every aspect of the rescue. But in the back of his mind, he found himself wondering about Victoria Sterling, about whether she had family or friends who would be there when she woke up in the hospital, about what it must be like to lose everything you owned in a single night. The fire was fully contained by sunrise, though the penthouse level was a total loss, and several floors below it had sustained significant damage. Jake finally allowed himself to sit down on the back of one of the fire trucks, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion that always followed major incidents. He thought about his 8-year-old son Tommy, who would be getting ready for school about now, probably wondering why his dad wasn't there to make breakfast and walk him to the bus stop as usual. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, but Jake still struggled with the balance between his dangerous profession and his responsibilities as a father. His ex-wife Sarah had remarried a lawyer who worked regular hours and came home every night without smelling like smoke or carrying the stress of life-and-death decisions. Tommy spent weekends with Jake, and those 48 hours every other week were the highlight of Jake's existence, though he knew they weren't enough to build the kind of relationship he wanted with his son. As the sun climbed higher, and the city began to wake up around them, Jake's thoughts returned to Victoria Sterling. He'd carried a lot of people out of burning buildings over the years, but something about this rescue felt different, though he couldn't quite identify what made it unique. Maybe it was the way she'd held on to him with such determination, or the moment when their eyes had met outside the building and he'd seen something beyond gratitude in her expression. Whatever it was, Jake found himself hoping she would recover fully and that she had people in her life who would help her rebuild from this devastating loss. Victoria Sterling woke to the steady beeping of medical monitors and the antiseptic smell of hospital air. Her throat felt raw, as if she'd swallowed sandpaper, and every breath reminded her of the smoke that had nearly claimed her life 12 hours earlier. The private room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center was bathed in soft afternoon light, a stark contrast to the orange inferno that had consumed her penthouse. As consciousness fully returned, so did the crushing realization that everything she owned, every material symbol of her success, had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. "Miss Sterling, you're awake," said Dr. Patricia Chen, entering with a warm smile and a tablet. "How are you feeling?" Victoria tried to speak but managed only a hoarse whisper. "Like I've been breathing fire." The doctor nodded knowingly. "That's normal after significant smoke inhalation. Your oxygen levels are good now, and the lung scans show no permanent damage. You were very lucky." Lucky. The word felt strange to Victoria, who had built her life on calculated risks and strategic planning, not luck. But she supposed being rescued from a burning building did qualify as fortunate, even if losing everything else didn't. Dr. Chen continued her examination while explaining Victoria's condition. "You'll need to stay another day for observation, but you should make a full recovery. The paramedics said the firefighter who carried you out mentioned you were conscious and cooperative throughout the rescue, which probably saved your life." Victoria's mind immediately conjured the image of strong arms carrying her through smoke and flame, of a calm voice reassuring her when terror threatened to overwhelm her completely. Captain Morrison. She remembered his name, though everything else about those terrifying minutes remained somewhat hazy. "I'd like to thank him," Victoria said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "The firefighter who rescued me." "Is that possible?" Dr. Chen smiled. "Actually, Captain Morrison called this morning to check on your condition. He seemed genuinely concerned about your recovery. I can have the hospital contact the fire department if you'd like to reach out to him." Something warm stirred in Victoria's chest at the thought that her rescuer had taken time from his undoubtedly busy schedule to inquire about her well-being. In her world of corporate relationships built on mutual benefit rather than genuine care, such concern from a virtual stranger felt both surprising and touching. As Dr. Chen left to complete her rounds, Victoria was left alone with the weight of her new reality. Her assistant, Marcus, had called repeatedly, no doubt fielding questions from the board of directors about her condition and the company's stability in the wake of the dramatic rescue footage that had dominated morning news broadcasts. The media loved stories that combined corporate power with human vulnerability, and Victoria Sterling being carried from a burning penthouse by a heroic firefighter was exactly the kind of narrative that drove ratings and social media engagement. Victoria's phone, miraculously undamaged despite everything, buzzed constantly with messages from business associates, board members, and reporters seeking statements. But she found herself unable to focus on the corporate crisis management that normally would have consumed her attention. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to those moments in Captain Morrison's arms when her survival had depended entirely on his strength and skill. She had spent her adult life being the person others relied on, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. Being completely dependent on someone else's competence was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Meanwhile, across the city at Station 19, Jake Morrison was dealing with his own aftermath from the previous night's rescue. The dramatic footage of him carrying Victoria Sterling from the burning penthouse had been captured by news helicopters and was playing on every local station. His fellow firefighters ribbed him good-naturedly about becoming a local hero, but Jake was more focused on the stack of incident reports that needed completion and the upcoming shift schedule that would determine whether he could attend Tommy's school play next week. "Morrison, you've got a visitor," called Lieutenant Stevens from the station's front desk. Jake looked up from his paperwork to see a well-dressed woman in her 50s approaching with a large flower arrangement and an envelope. "Captain Morrison?" I'm Margaret Walsh, Miss Sterling's assistant. She asked me to deliver these and to personally thank you for saving her life." Jake accepted the flowers awkwardly, unused to such formal gestures of gratitude. Most of the people he rescued sent standard thank you cards, if anything at all. The envelope contained a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Captain Morrison, I don't have adequate words to express my gratitude for your courage and skill last night. You gave me my life back when I thought it was over. I would very much like to thank you in person when my doctor releases me from the hospital. If you're willing, perhaps we could meet for coffee when your schedule allows. With deepest appreciation, Victoria Sterling." Below her signature was her personal phone number, written in the same elegant script. Jake studied the note, surprised by its personal tone. In his experience, wealthy people who found themselves in dangerous situations often treated first responders as hired help rather than individuals worthy of genuine connection. But there was something authentic about Victoria's words that suggested she saw him as more than just a uniform who had performed a duty. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, unsure whether he would actually use the phone number, but oddly touched that she had offered it. That evening, Jake sat at Tommy's bedside reading their nightly story. A tradition they had maintained, even after the divorce made everything else about their relationship more complicated. Tommy was fascinated by his father's rescue of the fancy lady from the TV, as he called Victoria, after seeing the news coverage. "Dad, why did her house burn down?" Tommy asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. "Sometimes accidents happen, buddy," Jake explained. "The important thing is that she's safe now." Tommy considered this seriously. "Is she sad that all her stuff burned up?" The question hit Jake unexpectedly. In all the excitement of the rescue and the media attention, he hadn't really considered the emotional toll of losing everything. "I imagine she is, Tommy." "It's hard to lose things that are important to you." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Maybe we could draw her a picture to make her feel better." "You always say pictures help when people are sad." The innocence of his son's suggestion stirred something in Jake's chest. Tommy had learned to process difficult emotions through art after his parents' divorce, and his childish drawings had indeed helped heal some of the wounds that legal proceedings and custody arrangements couldn't touch. Maybe there was wisdom in the idea that simple human gestures could provide comfort in ways that expensive flowers and formal thank you notes couldn't match. "That's a really nice idea, Tommy. What would you draw for her?" Tommy's face lit up with the enthusiasm he brought to all his creative projects. "A new house with lots of colors and maybe a dog, because dogs make everything better." 2 days later, Victoria was released from the hospital with instructions to rest and avoid strenuous activity while her lungs fully recovered. The penthouse she had called home for 5 years was uninhabitable, and insurance investigators were still determining the extent of her losses. Her assistant had arranged for a suite at the Four Seasons while she decided what to do next, but the impersonal luxury of the hotel felt hollow after the life-threatening reminder of how quickly material possessions could disappear. Sitting in the hotel suite's living room, surrounded by designer furniture that belonged to someone else, Victoria found herself thinking about Captain Morrison's note tucked in her purse. She had survived corporate boardroom battles and hostile takeover attempts, but the simple act of calling a stranger who had saved her life felt surprisingly daunting. What did she even have in common with a firefighter? Their worlds were so different that meaningful conversation seemed unlikely, yet something about their brief encounter had left her wanting to understand more about the man who had risked his life for hers. Victoria finally gathered the courage to call the number Jake had left with hospital staff. His voice was warm and slightly hoarse when he answered, probably from the smoke exposure they had both endured. "Captain Morrison, this is Victoria Sterling. I wanted to thank you again for what you did and to ask if you might have time for that coffee I mentioned." There was a pause, and Victoria wondered if she had made a mistake by reaching out. "I'd like that," Jake replied finally. "Are you sure you're feeling up to it? The doctor said you should be taking it easy." His concern for her recovery, coming from someone who barely knew her, felt more genuine than the worried inquiries from business associates who were probably more concerned about stock prices than her health. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the hospital, neutral territory that wouldn't overwhelm either of them with the trappings of their respective worlds. Victoria chose the location specifically because it was unpretentious, the kind of place where a CEO and a firefighter might actually find common ground. As she prepared for the meeting, she found herself changing clothes 3 times, unsure what was appropriate for coffee, with someone who had literally carried her to safety. Designer suits felt too formal, but casual clothes felt dishonest to who she was. Finally, she settled on dark jeans and a simple sweater, an outfit that felt more like herself than the power suits she wore to intimidate competitors. Jake arrived first, having requested the afternoon off from his supervisor, who was still basking in the positive media attention the rescue had brought to their station. He chose a corner table where they could speak privately, nursing a black coffee while watching the door for a woman he had only seen covered in soot and smoke. When Victoria entered, he was struck by how different she looked from the frightened, vulnerable person he had carried from the burning building. Her blonde hair was styled elegantly, and she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. But as she approached his table, Jake noticed something in her eyes that reminded him of the woman who had clung to him so desperately just days ago. Beneath the polished exterior was someone still processing a traumatic experience, still vulnerable, despite her obvious strength. "Captain Morrison," she said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed both grateful and nervous. "Please call me Jake," he replied, standing to pull out her chair. "And thank you for suggesting this. I'll admit I don't usually have coffee with the people I rescue." Victoria laughed, a sound that was more nervous than amused. "I'll admit I don't usually get rescued from burning buildings. This is new territory for both of us." Their conversation started awkwardly, both of them uncertain how to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. Victoria asked about Jake's career in firefighting, and he found himself sharing stories about why he had chosen such a dangerous profession. "My father was a firefighter," he explained. "He used to say that most jobs let you help people indirectly, but this work lets you save lives with your own hands. After he died fighting a warehouse fire when I was 16, I knew I wanted to follow in his footsteps." The vulnerability in his admission surprised Victoria, who was used to business conversations filled with carefully calculated revelations designed to establish dominance or extract information. Jake, in turn, asked about Victoria's business, and she found herself explaining the challenges of running a construction empire in an industry dominated by men who still questioned her qualifications despite years of proven success. "I had to be twice as smart and 3 times as ruthless as any man in my position," she said, stirring her latte absently. "There's no room for weakness or doubt when everyone is waiting for you to fail." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds exhausting. Do you ever get to just be yourself without all the armor?" The question caught Victoria off guard. No one in her professional life had ever asked about the personal cost of her success. As their coffee grew cold, both Jake and Victoria found themselves sharing more than they had intended. Victoria spoke about the isolation that came with her position, the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when people were always conscious of her wealth and power. Jake talked about the challenges of single parenthood, the way his dangerous job had contributed to his divorce, and his ongoing struggle to be the father Tommy deserved while maintaining the career that defined his identity. "It sounds like we both know something about sacrifice," Victoria observed quietly. Their conversation was interrupted when a small boy with sandy hair and bright eyes burst through the cafe door, followed by a woman in her early 40s. "Dad!" the boy called out, and Jake's face lit up with a warmth Victoria hadn't seen during their entire conversation. "Tommy, what are you doing here?" Jake asked as his son launched himself into his arms. "Mom had a doctor appointment, so Mrs. Henderson brought me. She said you were having coffee with the lady from the fire. Tommy turned to study Victoria with the unguarded curiosity of childhood, and she felt her heart skip as she recognized Jake's eyes in the boy's face. "Are you feeling better now?" Tommy asked Victoria directly, his concern so genuine that she felt tears prick her eyes. "Much better, thank you. And you must be the artist your father told me about." Tommy's face brightened considerably. "I made you something," he announced, digging into his backpack to produce a carefully folded piece of construction paper. Victoria opened it to reveal a drawing of a house with flowers and trees surrounding it, and a stick-figure family standing in front. "Dad said you lost your house, so I drew you a new one. And this is you and Dad and me, because Dad says people shouldn't be alone when sad things happen." The simple kindness of the gesture, combined with the child's matter-of-fact inclusion of himself and his father in her imagined future, overwhelmed Victoria in a way that no corporate sympathy had managed to do. She looked up to find Jake watching her reaction carefully, his expression unreadable. "This is the most beautiful house I've ever seen," she told Tommy seriously. "Thank you for thinking of me." Tommy beamed with pride. "Dad says you're really smart and run a big company. Do you like building things like we do with Legos?" Victoria found herself laughing genuinely for the first time since the fire. "I do like building things. Maybe you could show me your Lego creations sometime." As Mrs. Henderson collected Tommy for the remainder of his scheduled time with her, Victoria watched Jake's face transform as he hugged his son goodbye. The tenderness and love in his expression revealed depths she hadn't suspected during their conversation about careers and challenges. This was a man who understood what truly mattered, who had learned to balance strength and vulnerability in ways that Victoria found both admirable and somewhat foreign to her own experience. When they were alone again, and comfortable silence settled between them. "He's wonderful," Victoria said finally. "You're a good father." Jake's smile was tinged with sadness. "I try to be. The divorce was hard on him, and my schedule doesn't make things easier, but he's resilient." Victoria studied Jake's face, seeing the guilt and love warring in his expression. "He adores you. That's obvious to anyone watching you together." Jake met her eyes directly. "Being a parent changes everything, makes you realize that nothing else really matters as much as you thought it did." The observation hit Victoria with unexpected force, reminding her of how empty her own life had felt when she thought it might be ending in that burning penthouse. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Victoria found herself reluctant to end what had become the most genuine conversation she'd had in months. "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" she asked, surprising herself with the invitation. "I mean, when you're not working or with Tommy." Jake hesitated, and Victoria could see him weighing considerations she couldn't fully understand. "I'd like that," he said finally. "But I should probably warn you that my life is pretty complicated. Between work and Tommy and everything else, I don't have much to offer someone like you." Victoria smiled. "Someone like me?" Jake gestured vaguely at her expensive clothes and the luxury car visible through the cafe window. "Successful, important, used to a certain lifestyle." Victoria shook her head. "You saved my life, Jake. That trumps any lifestyle differences." They exchanged numbers before parting ways, both carrying the sense that something significant had begun, though neither could articulate exactly what it was. Victoria drove back to her hotel suite feeling lighter than she had since the fire, Tommy's drawing carefully placed in her purse like a talisman. Jake returned to the station house with the memory of Victoria's surprised laughter echoing in his mind, along with the realization that wealth and power didn't necessarily shield someone from loneliness and fear. Both of them went to sleep that night, thinking about the unexpected connection they had discovered over coffee, and wondering what it might mean for their carefully constructed but ultimately isolated lives. 3 weeks after the fire, Victoria found herself in Jake's modest kitchen, helping Tommy with his math homework while Jake prepared dinner. The domestic scene felt surreal, after years of catered meals and sterile hotel suites, but somehow completely natural. Tommy's tongue poked out in concentration as he worked through multiplication problems, occasionally asking Victoria to check his answers. You're really good at this, he told her seriously. Dad always gets confused with the hard ones. Victoria smiled, remembering her own struggles with homework in the years after her father died, when there was no one to help her navigate school challenges. The relationship had developed gradually, over coffee dates and casual dinners, with Victoria finding herself drawn into Jake's world of school events and weekend activities with Tommy. She had attended Tommy's soccer game the previous Saturday, cheering from the sidelines alongside other parents who had no idea she usually spent weekends reviewing acquisition proposals and market analyses. The simplicity of watching children play, of celebrating a goal or consoling a missed shot, reminded her of pleasures she had forgotten existed outside boardrooms and business negotiations. Jake emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming casserole dish, his hair still damp from the shower he'd taken after his shift. Victoria had learned to recognize the signs of difficult days at the station, the slight tension around his eyes, the way he held his shoulders when he'd been dealing with tragedy or loss. Today had been a car accident involving a family with young children, and though everyone had survived, Jake carried the weight of their trauma home with him. "Smells amazing," Victoria said, closing Tommy's math book and helping him clear his homework from the table. During dinner, Tommy chattered about his upcoming school science fair project, describing an elaborate plan to build a volcano that would erupt with different colored lava. Victoria said she could help with the engineering part, he announced between bites of Jake's homemade lasagna. She builds really big buildings, so she knows about making things that don't fall down. Jake glanced at Victoria with raised eyebrows. "You volunteered to help with a fourth-grade volcano?" Victoria laughed, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I may have gotten carried away discussing structural integrity during recess duty last week." The easy domesticity of the evening was interrupted by Victoria's phone, buzzing insistently on the counter. She glanced at the screen to see her assistant's name flashing urgently. "I should take this," she apologized, stepping into the living room. "Marcus, what's wrong?" His voice was tight with stress. "Victoria, we have a problem. The Henderson project is falling apart. The investors are threatening to pull out, and the city council is demanding answers about the structural modifications you approved. There's talk of a lawsuit if we don't have solutions by Monday morning." Victoria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with corporate crises, her mind immediately shifting into problem-solving mode. "Schedule an emergency board meeting for Sunday evening. Get the engineering reports to my suite tonight and arrange a conference call with the Henderson legal team first thing tomorrow." As she spoke, she became aware of Jake watching her from the kitchen doorway, Tommy peering around his father's legs with wide eyes. The transformation from dinner companion to CEO had been instantaneous and complete, a reminder of the vast differences in their worlds. After ending the call, Victoria returned to the table where Jake and Tommy sat in uncomfortable silence. "I'm sorry," she began, but Jake shook his head. "Don't apologize for who you are, Victoria. But maybe we should talk about this later." The rest of dinner passed quietly, with Tommy sensing the tension between the adults and focusing intently on his food. When it came time for Victoria to leave, Jake walked her to her car, while Tommy said goodbye from the front porch, waving with the enthusiasm that hadn't dimmed despite the awkward evening. "This is what I was worried about," Jake said quietly as they stood beside Victoria's luxury sedan. "Your life is complicated in ways I can't really understand. When you got that call, you became someone else entirely, someone I don't know." Victoria felt frustration rise in her chest. "That's my job, Jake. People depend on me to solve problems and make decisions. I can't just turn that off because it makes you uncomfortable." Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was struggling to find the right words. "I'm not asking you to turn it off. I'm asking if there's room in that life for what we're building here." The question hung between them like a challenge Victoria wasn't sure she could meet. Her relationship with Jake and Tommy had become precious to her in ways she hadn't expected, but the demands of her position weren't optional. Sterling Dynamics employed thousands of people and managed billions in assets. She couldn't simply walk away from those responsibilities for the sake of personal happiness, no matter how appealing the idea might be. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I've never tried to balance a relationship with everything else. It's always been work first, everything else if there's time." Jake nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression, even as disappointment shadowed his features. "Maybe that's something we both need to think about." They parted that night with a careful kiss that felt more like goodbye than goodnight, both of them aware that they had reached a crossroads that would determine whether their relationship could survive the realities of their different worlds. Victoria drove back to her hotel suite with a heavy heart, knowing that the crisis awaiting her attention would likely consume the next several days entirely. The Henderson Project emergency proved to be as complex and demanding as Victoria had feared. Sterling Dynamics had been contracted to build a mixed-use development that would revitalize a struggling neighborhood, but structural modifications requested by the city had created engineering challenges that threatened both the timeline and the budget. Victoria spent the next 4 days in marathon meetings with engineers, lawyers, city officials, and investors, working 18-hour days to find solutions that would satisfy all stakeholders while keeping the project viable. She called Jake twice during those 4 days, brief conversations where she explained she was dealing with a crisis and wouldn't be available until it was resolved. His understanding responses made her feel both grateful and guilty, knowing that he was once again adjusting his expectations to accommodate her professional demands. On Thursday evening, exhausted and running on caffeine and determination, Victoria finally reached a breakthrough that satisfied the city's safety concerns while maintaining the project's financial viability. As she left the final meeting, Victoria realized she had missed Tommy's science fair entirely. The volcano project they had planned together, the event she had promised to attend, had happened without her while she was locked in conference rooms, solving problems that seemed increasingly abstract compared to a child's excitement about colored lava and structural engineering. The weight of that missed commitment settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, heavier than any corporate responsibility she had ever carried. Victoria drove directly to Jake's house, arriving just as he was putting Tommy to bed. Through the front window, she could see father and son engaged in their nightly reading ritual, Tommy's head resting against Jake's shoulder as they shared a book. The scene represented everything she was missing by prioritizing work over relationships, everything she had convinced herself she didn't need until Jake and Tommy showed her what family actually meant. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering courage to face the disappointment she knew she had caused. Tommy answered the door in his pajamas, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Victoria, did you come to see my volcano? Dad took pictures and videos, and I got second place." His enthusiasm made Victoria's chest tight with emotion. "I'm so sorry I missed it, sweetheart. I had some very important work problems that I couldn't leave." Tommy's expression grew serious as he processed this explanation. "Was someone going to get hurt if you didn't fix it?" The innocent question cut straight to the heart of Victoria's justifications. Not hurt exactly, but people might have lost their jobs. Tommy nodded solemnly. "Then you did the right thing." Dad says sometimes grown-ups have to choose between different good things. Jake appeared behind his son, his expression carefully neutral. "Tommy, time for bed. Say goodnight to Victoria." After hugging her tightly and extracting a promise that she would see his volcano project at home, Tommy disappeared upstairs, leaving Victoria and Jake alone in the hallway. "I'm sorry," Victoria began, but Jake held up a hand to stop her. "Don't apologize for doing your job. Tommy understands, and so do I. But we need to talk about whether this is working for any of us." His tone was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who had reached a difficult decision. They sat on Jake's couch, the same place where Victoria had helped Tommy with homework just days earlier, though it felt like a lifetime ago. "I can't keep doing this," Jake said quietly. "Not just the canceled plans and missed events, but the feeling that I'm always going to come second to whatever crisis demands your attention. Tommy's getting attached to you, and I'm terrified of what happens when you decide this experiment in normal life isn't worth the complications." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. It's not an experiment, Jake. What we have is real. I just don't know how to balance it with everything else. Jake took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. I've been thinking about this a lot since Tuesday night. You've built an incredible life, Victoria. You're successful and powerful, and you change things that matter. But I need someone who can be present for the small moments too. Someone who can put Tommy and me first sometimes, even when other things seem more urgent. Victoria understood what he wasn't saying directly. He needed a partner, not someone who appeared occasionally between crises. And I don't know how to be that person, she admitted. I've never learned how to put personal relationships ahead of professional obligations. The honesty of her admission hung between them, like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Victoria had spent 15 years building sterling dynamics into an empire, sacrificing personal relationships and simple pleasures for the sake of achievement and success. Jake had built his life around Tommy and his work as a firefighter, understanding that some things mattered more than ambition or recognition. Their values weren't incompatible, but their priorities seemed fundamentally different in ways that threatened the foundation of their relationship. Maybe we're trying to force something that doesn't fit, Jake said finally, though the words clearly pained him. Maybe we're too different for this to work long term. Victoria wanted to argue, to find solutions and compromises that would let them build something together. But her recent behavior suggested that her instincts would always prioritize work over relationship. Maybe you're right, she whispered, though admitting it felt like losing something irreplaceable. They held each other on the couch for a long time, both grieving the end of something that had brought unexpected joy into their carefully structured lives. The next morning, Victoria returned to her usual routine of board meetings and conference calls, throwing herself into work with the intensity that had always been her refuge from emotional complexity. But the familiar rhythms of corporate leadership felt hollow in ways they never had before. Success that had once felt meaningful now seemed abstract and unsatisfying compared to the simple pleasure of helping a child with homework or watching a father's face light up when his son achieved something small but important. She found herself distracted during meetings, thinking about Tommy's upcoming soccer game and whether Jake would have to attend alone. Jake, meanwhile, struggled to explain Victoria's absence to Tommy without revealing the adult complexities that had ended their relationship. "Is Victoria mad at us?" Tommy asked during breakfast the morning after their conversation. "She seemed sad when she left last night." Jake chose his words carefully. "Victoria has a very important job that takes up most of her time. She cares about us, but sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices about how to spend their time." Tommy considered this seriously, like when you have to work on weekends and can't take me to the park. Jake nodded. "Something like that, buddy." 2 weeks passed with no contact between Victoria and Jake, both of them respecting the boundaries they had established, while privately hoping the other might reach out first. Victoria threw herself into a new project, the development of affordable housing that would use innovative construction techniques to provide quality homes at reduced costs. The work was meaningful and challenging, but it couldn't fill the void left by the absence of Jake's steady presence and Tommy's infectious enthusiasm for life's simple pleasures. The crisis that brought them back together came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon when Victoria was reviewing architectural plans in her temporary office. Jake called her personal phone, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Victoria, I need help. Tommy's been in an accident at school. He's okay, but he's asking for you and I don't know what to tell him." Victoria's heart stopped. "What happened?" "Which hospital?" Jake's relief at her immediate response was audible. "Children's Hospital downtown. He fell from the climbing structure during recess, broken arm and possible concussion, but the doctors say he'll be fine, but he keeps asking when you're coming." Victoria canceled her afternoon meetings without explanation and drove to the hospital faster than she had ever driven anywhere in her life. She found Jake in the pediatric emergency department, still wearing his work uniform, looking haggard and worried despite the doctor's reassurances. "How is he?" she asked, placing a hand on Jake's arm without thinking about the boundaries they had established. "Asking for you," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "The break is clean and the concussion is mild, but he's been crying for you since it happened. I didn't know if I should call, but he was so upset." Victoria found Tommy in a small examination room, his left arm in a temporary cast, and his face tear-streaked but brightening immediately when he saw her. "Victoria! You came." He reached for her with his good arm, and she carefully hugged him while being mindful of his injuries. "Of course I came, sweetheart. I heard you had an adventure on the playground." Tommy's smile was wobbly but genuine. "I was trying to reach the top like a superhero, but I fell instead. Dad says I'm brave, but I was really scared until you got here." The simple trust in his words broke something loose in Victoria's chest that had been frozen since their last conversation. As they waited for final discharge paperwork, Victoria and Jake sat on either side of Tommy's hospital bed, watching him color with his good hand while chattering about the cast he would get to keep and how he would ask his friends to sign it. The easy familiarity between the three of them returned naturally, as if the separation had been a bad dream rather than a deliberate choice. Victoria found herself holding Jake's hand across Tommy's bed, both of them focused entirely on the child, who had become the center of their shared world. "I was wrong," Victoria said quietly, while Tommy was distracted by a nurse who had brought him stickers. "About not being able to balance everything. When you called today, nothing else mattered except getting here. Not meetings or deadlines or corporate emergencies, just Tommy needing me." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "And I was wrong about you not being able to put us first. You dropped everything to be here." They looked at each other across Tommy's bed, both recognizing that love wasn't about perfect balance or ideal circumstances, but about showing up when it mattered most. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the kitchen of the house they had bought together, a modest colonial in a neighborhood where children played in the streets, and neighbors actually knew each other's names. She was helping Tommy prepare ingredients for the dinner Jake would cook when he returned from his shift, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. Sterling dynamics still demanded significant time and attention, but Victoria had learned to delegate more effectively and to establish boundaries that protected the hours she spent with her new family. The company had thrived under her new approach to leadership, with the affordable housing project becoming a model for sustainable development that attracted national attention. Victoria had discovered that having personal fulfillment actually made her more effective professionally, that the stability and joy she found at home enhanced rather than diminished her ability to lead and innovate. The board had initially been concerned about her reduced hours, but the company's continued success under her more balanced approach had silenced most critics. Tommy burst through the front door with the energy that marked the end of his school day, his cast finally removed and replaced with a small scar he displayed proudly to anyone willing to listen to the story of his playground adventure. "Victoria! Dad! Guess what happened today?" He launched into an elaborate tale of classroom drama involving a pet hamster and a missing piece of homework, his animated gestures and dramatic facial expressions making even the most mundane events seem like epic adventures. Jake arrived home 20 minutes later, tired but smiling, as he heard Tommy's voice echoing through the house. He found Victoria and Tommy in the kitchen, both covered in flour from their attempt to make homemade pasta, both laughing at something that probably wasn't actually funny, but felt hilarious in the context of their shared contentment. "How was your day?" Victoria asked, rising on her toes to kiss him hello, a gesture that still sent warmth spreading through his chest, even after months of domestic routine. "Better now," Jake replied honestly, wrapping his arms around both Victoria and Tommy in a group hug that had become their traditional greeting. As they prepared dinner together, sharing stories from their respective days and making plans for the weekend, Jake marveled at how naturally they had become a family. There had been challenges and adjustments, moments when their different backgrounds created misunderstandings or conflicts, but they had learned to navigate those differences with patience and love. That evening, As they sat on the front porch watching Tommy chase fireflies in their small yard, Victoria reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that terrifying night when Jake had carried her from a burning building. She had lost everything she thought mattered in that fire, only to discover that what she had built to replace it was infinitely more valuable than anything she had owned before. "Penny for your thoughts," Jake said, following her gaze to where Tommy was trying to catch fireflies in a mason jar. "Just thinking about how grateful I am," Victoria replied, leaning against Jake's shoulder. "For the fire, for you rescuing me, for Tommy, for all of it. I never knew I wanted this kind of life until I had it." Jake kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the flower dust from their afternoon baking adventure. "The fire brought us together, but we chose to build something beautiful from the ashes." Victoria smiled at the metaphor, thinking about the literal rebuilding that had defined her career and the emotional rebuilding that had defined their relationship. As night settled around them, and Tommy reluctantly came inside to begin his bedtime routine, Victoria and Jake remained on the porch for a few more minutes, content in the quiet satisfaction of a life built on love rather than ambition, on presence rather than achievement. They had learned that true success wasn't measured in quarterly profits or professional recognition, but in the laughter of a child, the comfort of partnership, and the deep peace that came from being exactly where you belonged. Sometimes, the most important rescue wasn't from a burning building, but from a life lived without love, without family, without the simple joy of coming home to people who truly knew and accepted you.